"This," the large man said, pointing his finger directly at the smaller man's chest, "is what they teach in cinema." The laughter started at the front of the hall and rolled backward through 4,000 people until it hit the walls and came back. It was not a polite laugh. It was the laugh of a room that had already made its decision. He was small, 5 feet 7 inches, 140 pounds in dark street clothes, no uniform, no rank badge, no credential visible anywhere on his body. His hands were loose at his sides, his feet were slightly apart. He stood in the center of the main training floor at the Kodokan Judo Institute in Tokyo, and he was completely still. The man pointing at him was the opposite of small. 6 feet 2, 220 pounds, an Olympic gold medalist who had stood on a podium in this same city 3 years earlier while his national anthem played to a packed arena. He was not a bully. He was a man making an argument in front of 4,000 witnesses. "Not what stops a real man," he said. The room did not need him to be louder. It had already agreed. I was 19 years old, sitting in the 4th row, close enough to see the smaller man's face clearly. I was looking for what always appears when a room turns against someone. The flinch, the flush, the small crack in a person's expression when they realize they are standing completely alone. I had seen it happen to men who had trained their entire adult lives. There was nothing. The man in the black shirt stood surrounded by 4,000 people laughing at him, and his face gave away absolutely nothing. He was not afraid. He was not angry. He was waiting for something. I could not name it yet. Then Viktor Petrov took one step forward. The laughter got louder, and the man in black did not move at all. That morning had begun quietly. No one who walked through the Kodokan's entrance before 8 o'clock could have known what the afternoon would hold. Tokyo, Japan, March 1967. The Kodokan Judo Institute stood in the Bunkyo ward like a building that understood its own importance. Founded in 1882 by Jigoro Kano, 85 years of champions had trained on those mats. Olympic medalists, military commanders, heads of state from 4 continents. Every serious practitioner of any combat discipline in the world knew what the Kodokan represented. Not simply a training facility, a standard, the kind of institution whose authority did not need announcing, because it had been accumulating for nearly a century. Viktor Petrov was 34 years old, 6 feet 2, 220 pounds, built from 2 decades of competitive judo at the highest level the sport offered. He had represented his country at the 1964 Tokyo Olympics, and had not merely competed, he had won. He stood on a podium in this same city with gold against his chest, while the arena held 70,000 people. That was not a memory he carried lightly. It was the central fact of his life, the thing everything else arranged itself around. He was not a violent man. He was a precise one. He had trained across 7 countries and rolled with champions from the Soviet Union, Germany, France, and Japan. He understood exactly what a prepared human body could do when correctly applied to another trained human body. The answer, after 20 years of honest investigation, was judo. What had irritated him in the 3 years since Tokyo was something spreading across the world in movie theaters and newspaper columns. The idea that cinematic fighting represented something true about combat. Fast hands filmed from flattering angles, acrobatic kicks thrown against opponents who fell on cue. He did not find it threatening. He found it the way a surgeon finds a rumor, worth correcting before it caused damage. He had come to Tokyo for a 3-week training residency. He had not come looking for a confrontation. But that morning, a name moved through the corridors of the Kodokan the way smoke moves under a door. A Chinese-American film actor had arrived in the building. Petrov heard the name. He set his training bag on the floor, and he walked toward the main hall with one very specific expression on his face. Not anger. Something quieter than anger. The name had reached everyone by the time Petrov entered the main hall. It moved through the Kodokan the way important names always move through closed buildings. Not announced, not broadcast, but passed from one mouth to the next until it had touched every person in the room. Bruce Lee is here, the film actor, the one from Hong Kong. Word traveled faster than the man himself. I had seen the big boss 4 months earlier in a theater in Shinjuku. I told my training partner that morning, and he looked at me the way senior students look at junior ones when they say something worth ignoring. He was 23. He had been at the Kodokan for 5 years. He told me to focus on my footwork. Bruce Lee arrived at the entrance to the main training floor, accompanied by a Japanese film producer and a translator. He bowed at the edge of the mat. Not a performative bow, the precise, measured bow of someone who understood exactly what the gesture meant and gave it its full weight. He removed his shoes, he set them beside the door, and stepped back to the edge of the training area in his dark street clothes and stood quietly, watching. He was not studying the techniques. He was studying the space between the techniques, the way men moved in the transitions, the gaps that opened and closed between one motion and the next. The translator approached a senior instructor and explained that Mr. Lee had come to observe. He had no intention of interrupting training. He was grateful for access to the floor. Petrov crossed the room before the translator had finished. He walked the way men walk when the conversation in their head is already complete. Steady, unhurried, decided. He stopped 6 feet from Bruce Lee and addressed him through the shared translator without introduction or preamble. "I have a question for the film actor," he said. The training floor went quiet in the way that training floors go quiet when something outside the schedule is happening. The techniques in your films, the footwork, the combinations, the speed, do they function against a man who has genuinely trained to resist them? The laughter came immediately. Not cruel, the spontaneous, unguarded laughter of 4,000 people hearing a question that already had an obvious answer. Bruce Lee did not respond defensively. He did not explain himself. He looked at Petrov, looked briefly at the crowd, and said through the translator, quietly and without any hesitation at all, "That is a fair question." The laughter got louder. They expected denial. They got agreement. Nobody in that hall knew what to do with that. Petrov pressed forward. He gestured toward a large senior student standing 20 feet away. A third-degree black belt, 190 pounds, 5 years of Kodokan training on his body. "Then demonstrate," Petrov said. "Show us what cinema teaches. Use your technique on one of our students. Let the floor decide." The senior student stepped forward. The crowd surged inward. Men stood on benches to see. The narrator stood on his seat without realizing he had done it. Bruce Lee looked at the student. He looked at Petrov. He looked at 4,000 people pressing toward the mat with their minds already made up. He was quiet for 4 full seconds. The laughter from the crowd expanded to fill the silence completely. Then Bruce Lee nodded once and said, "I have a better idea." Instead of moving toward the student, Bruce Lee turned back to Viktor Petrov. Through the translator, calmly, with no performance in his voice and no edge in his words, he made a single request. He asked Petrov to demonstrate first the throw that had won him gold in Tokyo, the technique he had spent 20 years building into the architecture of his body. "Show me," Bruce Lee said, "so I understand what I am dealing with." Petrov did not hesitate. He called the large senior student forward, and the room watched what 2 decades of elite competition looks like when it is fully expressed. A seo nag, a shoulder throw, executed with the kind of precision that does not require force because the geometry is already perfect. The student left the ground, traveled through the air, and hit the mat with a sound that traveled to the back wall and returned. Clean, total, final. The crowd applauded. Petrov straightened up and looked at Bruce Lee with the patience of a man who has already made his point. Bruce Lee waited for the applause to settle. Then he said 3 words. "Now try it on me." The laughter stopped as if a switch had been thrown. Not gradually, immediately. 4,000 people held the same breath at the same moment. The narrator felt the temperature in the room change. He felt it in his hands before he understood it in his mind. Petrov made an honest calculation. He had thrown men considerably larger than the person standing in front of him. He had thrown trained wrestlers, Soldiers, judo practitioners with decades of resistance experience. He looked at the 140 pounds of stillness in the black shirt and arrived at a conclusion that 20 years of evidence fully supported. This would take 4 seconds. He moved, fast for his size, the kind of fast that surprises people the first time. He reached for collar and sleeve, the standard grip sequence, the grip his hands had closed 10,000 times in training and competition. What happened in the next 2 seconds, the narrator still could not fully explain 30 years later. Bruce Lee did not retreat. He did not block. He moved at an angle that did not exist inside Petrov's training. Not backward, not sideways, but somewhere between those directions that Petrov's muscles had never indexed, because no opponent had ever occupied that position. Petrov's hands closed on fabric and found no resistance point beneath it. His weight had already committed. Bruce Lee was no longer where the throw required him to be. Petrov reset. He tried again. Same result, not because Lee was overpowering him, but because the geometry Petrov's body had memorized assumed a specific kind of human being standing opposite him. Lee was not that kind. He was something 20 years of judo preparation had never accounted for. A third attempt, the same answer. Bruce Lee stepped back. He did not counterattack. He did not throw Petrov. He simply returned to his relaxed stance and stood there, hands loose, weight low, and waited. That restraint, the deliberate choice not to capitalize, landed on the crowd harder than any technique could have. 4,000 people had been laughing 9 minutes ago. Now the hall was so quiet, the narrator could hear the fluorescent lights running above the mat. Bruce Lee looked at Petrov. "Your throw is perfect," he said through the translator. "Inside the conditions it was designed for, nothing I know could stop it." He paused for exactly long enough. "But you moved first, and when you moved, you told me everything." Petrov looked at him, not with humiliation, with something more complicated than that. The narrator recognized the expression because he had worn it himself. The specific look of a man whose certainty has not been defeated, but has been quietly, permanently rearranged. No instructor stepped forward to close the exchange. No senior official announced the resumption of training. No one did anything at all. 2 men stood on the mat, in the middle of 4,000 people, and the 4,000 people simply waited, because whatever was happening on that floor was not finished, and everyone in the building understood that without being told. Petrov spoke first. The edge that had been in his voice when he crossed the room 30 minutes earlier was completely gone. What replaced it was something the narrator had never heard from a man of Petrov's standing, a genuine question with no performance behind it. He asked Bruce Lee how. Not how did you avoid the throw. How does a man train to move like that? What produces that kind of adaptability? What system builds a body that can find angles that do not exist in any established curriculum? Bruce Lee began to walk as he answered, the slow, thinking walk the narrator had seen in his films, except here it was real and unrehearsed and happening 10 feet away. He said that Petrov's judo was not the problem. The system was not the problem. 20 years of honest training was not the problem. "You have built something true," he said. "Every hour of it was real. Every repetition was genuine." He paused to let the translator finish. But a system trained against one kind of opponent can only see that kind of opponent. Your body has spent 20 years learning the answer to a specific question. When I asked a different question, your body did not have the answer yet. That is not a failure of judo. That is what happens to any system that stops asking. He stopped walking. He looked at Petrov directly. Judo is not a cage, but if you only ever move inside it, you build walls without knowing it. The walls feel like strength from the inside. Petrov was quiet for a moment. Then he said something the narrator would carry for the rest of his life. "You let them laugh," he said. It was not an accusation. It was recognition. Bruce Lee's answer was 4 words. I waited for it to finish. The narrator looked around the hall when that sentence landed. Men who had trained for decades were standing absolutely still. The same men who had been laughing 40 minutes ago were now wearing the expression of people who had arrived at a lecture expecting entertainment and discovered they were the material being studied. 3 years later, Viktor Petrov quietly enrolled in a cross-discipline training program, the first Olympic Judo gold medalist to do so publicly on record. He never offered an explanation. The people who had been in the Kodokan that March afternoon did not need one. Training resumed 30 minutes after Bruce Lee and his translator walked out of the building. The instructors returned to their students. The drills restarted. From a distance, from the corridor outside the main hall, it looked exactly like any other afternoon at the Kodokan. It was not. The narrator noticed it in the quality of the movement. Men who had performed the same techniques 10,000 times were performing them slowly, as if each motion had become a question they were asking their own bodies for the first time. Something in the room had shifted at a level that mat time and repetition could not immediately reach. Bruce Lee flew back to Hong Kong within the week. He had accepted a role that would become Enter the Dragon. He was 26 years old. He had 6 years left. In 1971, a Japanese martial arts journal published a brief interview with an unnamed instructor who had been present at the Kodokan that afternoon. The interviewer asked what he remembered most clearly about the exchange. The instructor sat with the question for a long moment before he answered. "The laughter," he said finally, "and then the silence after it. I have spent 4 years trying to understand what happened in the space between those two sounds. I am not finished yet." Bruce Lee died on July 20, 1973. He was 32 years old. Enter the Dragon was released 6 days later. The world mourned a film star. The people who had shared a room with him mourned something that does not have an easy name. The narrator found out through a radio announcement. He was sitting in his apartment 2 blocks from the Kodokan. He did not move for a long time. He thought about a man standing still in the center of a hall while 4,000 people laughed. He thought about what that kind of stillness costs a person. He thought about it for a long time. The narrator is in his late 60s now. He has trained in martial arts for 50 years. He has watched thousands of matches, sat ringside at championship bouts on 4 continents, and shared mats with men whose names filled stadium banners. He has seen fighters who could break anything in front of them. He has seen men whose technique was as close to perfect as a human body can achieve. He has never forgotten the sound of 4,000 people laughing at one man. And he has never forgotten the sound of those same 4,000 people going completely silent 11 minutes later. He says he has spent decades thinking about what happened in the space between those two sounds. He thinks he finally understands it. Bruce Lee did not come to the Kodokan to prove anything. He came to learn. But Viktor Petrov made him into a lesson instead. And Bruce Lee accepted the assignment without hesitation, without anger, without a single word of complaint. He walked into the center of that laughter barefoot and waited for the room to understand what it was looking at. Most men would have fought that assignment. Most men would have needed the room to be wrong before they could be right. Viktor Petrov won his gold medal in front of 70,000 people. It is in a case somewhere, cold brass and faded ribbon. But the story carried in the mouths of Kodokan instructors across 5 decades, the one passed from teacher to student like something too valuable to write down. That story has no medal in it. It has one small man standing still, in a room that did not know yet what stillness meant.